begin. A couple of things, though. I want to pick up where I was last week, obviously. And then we'll discuss the energy chapter. But since I really don't like it, I've come up with a lot of different stuff. So today is the one lecture where I really go off the textbook and discusses things that you won't find even in most of the reading. So good thing that you showed up. Okay, so, but just to conclude the chapter on cities last week, we were sort of discussing urban planning. So the difference between urban land markets and many other types of market is that government intervention is typically much more significant. So if you decide to grow potatoes, you've got a few rules to follow. Okay, whatever that is. But the government will not tell you, well, you must plant potatoes in that part of your field and perhaps, I don't know, kiwis and other tomatoes in that area. Land markets are also based on supply and demand, meaning that developers will only build things that they believe will pay. But they're again limited in terms of what they can build and where they can build it. And urban planning has been around for a bit more than a century. And this sort of government intervention was justified from the beginning on the notion that there were market failures that builders would not address, and that if you wanted pleasant cities that would not be overcrowded, or if you wanted to make sure that there would be enough infrastructure to serve the new condos or the new city or the new houses that would be built or any kind of new development, you needed sort of someone in charge to at least provide broad guidelines. Now, there are obviously differences between the type of zoning between one city and another. In North America, Houston, the city of Houston in Texas, has very little formal zoning. So if you ever get the opportunity to visit the place, it's a bit weird by Toronto standard, at least in as much as you can really do what you want with your house. As long as you have a single detached house, it can be any kind of color, any sort of material. And you've got neighborhoods that I find interesting that way. And you get away with building stuff in Houston that you wouldn't in many other jurisdictions. In some cities, there are restrictions in terms of the land that you can build on. So many cities have a green belt. Others have restrictions in terms of height. And as I will discuss in a few slides, and there is a question based on that, and I will give you the exact answer that I want, the inability of builders to supply enough housing for people can be a problem. And when the demand is strong, well, obviously, the price of housing will tend to go up. So I believe that we discussed that last time. There won't be any specific question on urban planning, but again, there are formal guidelines, there are restrictions to buildings, and urban plans will vary between jurisdictions. So some cities will say, well, we have very little zoning, and so we're very developers friendly. Others will say, well, in order to preserve our quality of life, or to favor, let's say, more public transit, and get people out of their vehicles, we will invest in LRTs. We won't build as many highways as in other locations. And ultimately, I believe that people sort of sort themselves out. I mean, if you want to live in a place like Vancouver, where housing is very expensive because they have huge green belts around the cities, many areas where you cannot build. They also don't have many highways. Well, you find ways to live in Vancouver if you can afford to find a job there and afford that market. On the other hand, if you would rather live in a place like Houston, where you say, well, I can buy, I can get 4 times more square footage by dollar invested, then, I'll go with that, but the city might not be as pretty. I mean, I might have to put up with a neighbor who builds what I consider a ugly house next to mine. So, again, there are trade-offs that ways. Okay. Easy question for you. So would you write this down? NIMBYism, bananas, and incumbent club. Any of you is familiar with the expression NIMBY? I'll ask you to remember it. That's an easy question, easy throwaway. Okay, that stands for not in my backyard. So yes, I understand that there's a housing shortage in Toronto. More housing should be built, just not in my neighborhood. And that's kind of a problem when you have a real hot market like Toronto, and obviously, many people are moving in every year. you need to accommodate them by building more housing. I mean, you can only pack so many people within a particular unit. Where are you going to build this stuff? On the one hand, well, we've got a green belt, we don't want them to build in the suburbs, but then try to build in the city, and the people who already live in the neighborhood want to preserve the quality of their neighborhood. They don't want to see big condo towers going up in their backyards. What do you do? So that's kind of a problem. So NIMBY stands for not in my backyard. What about banana? One of you familiar with the expression? Don't build anything anywhere, anytime. So what if I ask you what banana stands for? Don't build anything anywhere, anytime. And the incumbent club is another expression that is sort of popular in policy circles to describe the people who moved into an area when it was relatively affordable, and they're kind of opposed to building things, not only because they don't want the character of their neighborhood to be changed, but they understand that the more restrictions you put on building new houses, and the more popular your city is, the more your house will increase in value. So let's say you bought a single detached house in Vancouver in the 1970s. You're a person now, your kids are gone. Obviously there would be the demand to buy your lot, demolish your house, and build something bigger. It might still be in your own interest to favor regulations that are against that, because so many people want to live in Vancouver that the value of your house will increase much more than if people were free to do what they wanted. So the incumbent club refers to people who are already in a market or people who enter the market when it was affordable and oppose new growth because they benefit from the rise in real estate prices. But I'll probably stick to NIMBY and bananas. So you get the idea. So at what point you've got to decide, well, is the city for the people who were born there or moved there decades ago, or should we also keep in mind the standard of living and the opportunities that we should afford to people who want to move in a place, but obviously don't live there at the moment? So do these people who want to move in a particular location have rights, or should we defer to people who were born in a particular neighborhood, might have bought the house from their parents, or might have even inherited it, and don't really want things to change? So was a right to the city in that context. So these are issues that you see becoming prominent in all fast-growing cities. Now again, I don't want to pick on Buffalo or Rochester too much, as I did in previous lectures, but obviously this is not a problem when your city declines economically. But in a city like Toronto, who has the right to the city? The people who are already there, but should the people who also want to move in, how should we try to accommodate them? Okay. So this I'll ask you to remember, because this is from one of your mandatory readings, but not from the textbook. So as you probably know, or as you'll soon find out if you leave your parents' house and want to buy or rent something on your own, housing is pretty expensive in places like Vancouver and Toronto. And one solution that has been put forward for a very long time, and that particular study is but the latest iteration, is to say, well, you might not like a city that becomes more dense, you might not like big condo towers, you might not like building more houses in the suburbs, but if you want to make housing more affordable in a place like Toronto or Vancouver, you can't square a circle. With people moving in, if you want to keep housing affordable, you need to build more houses. You just can't expect people not to live in your particular city. Or else if you do that, if you have let's say, a core city that is in high demand, you have a green belt around it, you don't allow people to build in the city, demolish houses to build condo towers, what typically happens is that development jumps over the green belt and people commute even more. So the Fraser Institute, which is one of those think tank, but a right-wing / pro-market one that I've discussed before, put out a studies a few months ago that looked at how the basic features of land use regulation impact the housing supply. In other words, how easy is it to build new houses when there's a demand for it? And then what they put forward, so they had a survey and they asked builders, well, how easy is it to build in Brampton, in Oakville, in Ajax, in Oshawa, in Toronto, in Hamilton? But their key argument is the one that has been around for a very long time, if you believe in free market economics and supply and demand. The issue is that the more difficult you make it to build, so by restricting supply with less supply, what happens? Well, in places, again, where there is a high demand, housing prices will go up. Let's say you've got 100,000 people a year moving into Toronto. You don't build new houses, either condo towers or detached houses in the suburbs or semi-detached or whatever. Well, people move to Toronto because they can find jobs here. They can generate income. And so what they will do is that they'll try to live somewhere, obviously. And the more people you have, the more income they have, the more they will be willing to pay more to live in Toronto because of the opportunities that are offered in the city of Toronto proper or in the greater Toronto area. So if you restrict the supply of housing, you've got more people moving in with more income, well, the price of housing will go up. Again, you can't square a circle, there's no way around it. Now, in terms of other impacts, well, obviously, if you're an employer in Toronto, it becomes increasingly difficult to either attract or retain employees if they cannot afford to live in the city. So speaking from something I know, the academic world, I can tell you that the University of British Columbia in Vancouver has been struggling for years to either attract or retain faculty, because even though they pay them a fairly decent amount of money, the cost of housing is so expensive in Vancouver that either people don't take a job there, or else if they do, when they want to have kids and move in the suburb, they realize that they can't afford it. I mean, they already knew that. And they might take jobs in places like Western or Queens, because the cost of living in London, Ontario, or Kingston is much more affordable. And so for years, UBC has been struggling with that. U of T also, but to be honest, to a lesser extent. I mean, there are still more options in Toronto than in Vancouver. But obviously what is true for universities is true for other lines of work too. If you're an employer and you want to hire the best employees possible, either you pay them a huge premium to make city living affordable, or else if you can't do that, well, people might consider relocating, taking in other jobs, either in the more distant suburbs or in smaller cities like Guelph or Hamilton or what have you, or else they might move to some other city which is much more affordable. And so even if you earn a fairly decent income, if you get the same kind of paycheck in Toronto or in Houston, where in Houston, again, you get 2 or 3 times more house for your money than in Toronto, well, a lot of people will put up with the muggy summers in Houston and perhaps, you know, the 8-lane highway that they might not like all that much, but because they get more real estate for their money. At the same time, if you have restrictions in the core city and you don't want to allow people to build huge condo towers, well, that simply means that more housing will be built in the suburb than would otherwise be the case. And the result is more traffic congestion and longer commutes. So again, if you have people who work downtown and you don't allow people, developers to build enough high-rise condos that people can afford, well, people will still want to live somewhere. Chances are they'll live further away from their work, and you'll get more commutes and more traffic congestion that way. So I don't know, many of you commute in from Brampton. To be honest, I don't do it. I'm told it's pretty awful. But yeah, you don't allow people to live closer to their place of employment than they would if it was more affordable. Then you get longer commutes and more traffic congestion. So I guess that's kind of the ransom of success, but you make commuting and housing affordability more painful than they would otherwise be if you allow people to build more. Now, but there's obviously a cost to building more, and one of them might be preserving green space around a city. So again, there are trade-offs here. Typically, people who already own their house would like more green space. People who would like to move in a city and would like it to be more affordable say, well, you know, the green belt doesn't need to be as big as Prince Edward Island as it is at the moment. It could be a bit smaller. Okay? Okay, so bid rent theory, okay, I'll skip that. Okay, energy and mineral resources. To be honest, I really don't like that chapter. So what I plan to do is the following. I'll skip a lot of slides. I mean, I'll go over the content even more quickly than usual, but I'll stop to the two places where I really want you to remember something. And then I will focus on a topic which I believe is kind of relevant and not treated quite adequately in the chapter. So this is where I use my power as a faculty to decide, you know, to focus on one or two issues in depth rather than too much stuff treated somewhat unsatisfactorily. But at any rate, if you have an interest in resource industrialization and non-market value, renewable energy, factors that drive the resource cycle, boom and bust cycles, there's information in that chapter, but truth be told, I teach a whole course on energy policy, so if this is something you have an interest in, I can assure you it's much less boring than this one because I've developed my own material. I don't use a textbook. Okay, so the authors come from a tradition which views resources as culturally created. So what they mean by that is that there's always been stuff on the earth. There are rocks, minerals, petroleum, brines of salted water, wind, solar rays. But resources only really appear when human beings came along, because for most life forms, I mean, might be a few bacteria here that might disagree, but petroleum is not a resource. Iron ore is not a resource. The wind is useful if you're, let's say, a bird, a raptor that uses wind patterns to migrate between locations, but really, resources only appeared with human beings, and some resources appeared before others. So our remote ancestors could turn a number of rocks into something useful, but they didn't know what to do with iron ore or with petroleum at the beginning. But as societies became more complex, as people learned to do many more things, as people specialized in what they did best and traded with each other, things like petroleum, for example, became a resource over time, whereas before that, it was really a nuisance. I mean, all the way up to maybe 1850, so a century and a half ago, if you were a farmer in the United States, one of the worst things that could happen to you would be to find petroleum on your property. Because if you did that, it would probably contaminate your water supply and make your cows sick. Or else if you tried to water your crops with water that had petroleum in it, it wasn't exactly good for your corn. So there's a lot of stuff around us. Not everything is a resource. Some stuff becomes resource over time, but some resources can become more valuable over time, others less so. Okay, so there's the standard distinction between non-renewable resources, which in theory deplete with use. So the more petroleum we consume, the less of it we have in the long run, or so we might think. And renewable resources, so it doesn't matter how much wind you use today in your wind turbine, it won't affect the supply of wind tomorrow, or a few thousand or a few million years down the road. The authors also discuss ownership and control, technological innovation, but that I will discuss in more detail in the rest of the lecture. Okay, make a note for table 9.1. They discuss the classification of ecosystem services. I will ask you to reproduce some portions of that slide. Essentially, what they argue is that nature does provide us stuff that is useful. So if you discuss, for example, nutrition, well, biomass, the living stuff around us, the plants and the animals, and water are obviously crucial. In terms of materials, well, you can have stuff that grows out of the ground, stuff that you eat, stuff like cotton that you use to clothe yourself. Water is always useful. In terms of energy, well, you can burn wood, you can burn other kinds of stuff, but there's also other types of energy that are available, wind and solar and what have you. In terms of regulation and maintenance, well, how do you deal with some toxic substances? So nature always has the capacity to absorb and break down a certain amount of what we would consider nasty stuff, which if it was in larger volumes or more concentrated would be a problem. But there are many ecosystems that can actually turn stuff that could be harmful to humans into something useful, and that's viewed as an ecosystem service. Okay, in terms of cultural, you've got physical and experiential interactions, intellectual and representational interactions. I won't really quiz you about the cultural, but make a note, table 9.1, and provisioning, regulation, and maintenance. It's pretty self-explaining, and I'll tell you how many of these I want. I'll probably ask for only 2 of those, and I'll be specific. Okay? So a few things, resources are unevenly distributed. Petroleum, for example, Canada has a lot of it, but most of it is concentrated in the prairies, the Western Canadian basin. You've got some of it off the coast of Newfoundland and Nova Scotia, but not too much. If you look at the planet per se, well, many countries don't have any petroleum at all. Others have a large amount of it, especially in light of their small populations. And the way you need to think about fossil fuels, they describe it as the lifeblood of the global economy, but I think a better way to think about fossil fuels is that they're the food of our machines. And what I mean by that is that you could not function as a human being without food. Well, we could not survive, or we could not have the standard of living that we have right now if it wasn't for the machines around us, everything from the stuff that moves things around to the stuff that manufactures things. And the reason why we have such a high standard of living compared to our ancestors is that we have a lot more machine doing a lot more work than was the case even not too long ago. And fossil fuels in the context are the food of our machines. And that's why our economies would not give us the standards of living that we have if we did not feed our machines. Now, I'm not saying that this is all good and that there aren't externalities associated with that, but honestly, thinking about the energy is always kind of abstract, but if you think of it as the food of our machines, then you sort of understand how important energy is to our standard of living. Okay, so selected commodities, which countries produce the most? I won't quiz you on that, obviously, but there are things that might be of interest to you. Canada and Australia are big players. They're large countries with small population, and part of their living standard is explained in large part by their large endowment of resources in light of their small populations. Okay, so crude oil exports and imports. So this is the figure in the textbook. I don't like it. I like this one a lot better. Now, the thing about oil and the way to think about it is that oil is a liquid and it will flow where it is needed. So moving petroleum between countries and between continents is relatively easy because a liquid can be moved easily either through pipelines on land or through tanker ships over the water. And so you can see that a number of countries do trade oil with each other. So Canada, for example, exports oil to the United States. The way the system is worked is that it's really Alberta that exports most of its oil to the American Midwest. But the funny thing is that Canada does import oil from other countries in its eastern part. And that's partly because of, that's entirely because of geography, because eastern Canada is further away from Alberta than a place like Chicago, for example, that receives a lot of oil from Alberta. And if you travel in the western United States, it's a flat prairie, it's easy to build pipeline. You go east, it's the Canadian Shield. It's very tough rock. It's kind of hard to build a pipeline in those, and the distances are much longer. So while Ontario does get some oil from Alberta, most of Alberta oil actually goes to the United States, and obviously to the parts of the United States that are closest to Alberta. But then there is also a lot of petroleum transportation the world over. So some places like the Middle East have way too much petroleum for their population. Places like Europe don't have much petroleum, but they require a lot of petroleum products. Japan is the same, so there's obviously a lot of trade between people who have a lot of that resource and people who want and can afford to pay for that resource. Okay, natural gas. Now, moving gas around is a lot more complicated. The energy density is much lower. Moving natural gas on land can be done. Obviously, that's why we build pipelines for gas. But as you can see, there isn't much movement of natural gas between continents. And that's because the only way to move gas by ship is to concentrate the gas. And the way you do that is by cooling it. So basically, you build a big facility that will use some of the gas that goes into it to refrigerate gas or increase the density. You can put some on a ship. You send it across an ocean, and then you let the gas return to ambient temperature, and you can sort of ship it that way. But it's really not convenient. It's expensive. Really, you can only move so much gas on a boat, and there are price differentials between locations that produce the gas and locations that want the gas must be really huge to make it worthwhile. So there are markets for natural gas between countries, but it's obviously not to the same extent as markets for petroleum. And in this case, what's interesting is that Canada does export, for example, natural gas to the United States. Again, there were historically huge surpluses of gas in places like Alberta, a big market in the United States. But especially with the advent of fracking, what has happened in the United States is that deposits in places like Pennsylvania, going all the way down to Texas, have made a lot more gas available. And it made sense economically to ship gas from some corner of the United States to some corners of Canada, and to have some other parts of Canada export natural gas to the United States. But again, fracking has completely hydraulic fracturing has completely changed natural gas markets over the last decade. And yeah, there would be a lot to say, and I say a lot about that in my other course. But again, just keep in mind that moving natural gas is a lot more difficult than moving a liquid. And then you've got coal. Now, nobody likes coal today, but what most people don't realize is that coal production and consumption keeps going up. Now, it's been going down in places like the United States because the advent of fracking has made a lot more natural gas available, and natural gas has displaced a lot of coal, and especially electricity generation. But in many other parts of the world where you don't have that much fracking, especially in a place like China that has a lot of coal, well, people want more electricity. You need more food for your machines. In that case, the way the food is produced is by burning coal to produce electricity that then becomes the food of other machines. The way a place like China is industrialized is by burning a lot of coal. And as you can see, there is an international and intercontinental market for coal. It's not as big as petroleum, but what's interesting is that in the United States, a lot of coal production that used to be consumed in the United States has been displaced by natural gas because it's cleaner and it's become less expensive. But because they already have a lot of railroads and a lot of large and well-equipped ports, what has happened in the United States in many cases is that the coal that has been displaced from local consumption is now exported to other countries that don't have fracking and don't have natural gas. Now, without getting into the details, there are different qualities of coal, and the best quality is used to produce steel, not to produce electricity. And a couple of countries like Canada, especially British Columbia and Alberta, and some parts of Australia, especially Western Australia, have good quality coal, and they export it to other countries, not so much again to produce electricity, but to produce steel. So Canada is an important coal exporter, but you can see how significant Australia is. And again, it's not, they will export coal to China, a country that has a lot of coal, but the Australian coal is of better quality, and if you want to produce steel, in some cases it makes sense, even if you're in China and you've got plenty of coal not too far from you, to import it from Australia because the stuff is of better quality. So that's the difference between steam coal and mill coking coal here. Okay. Okay, I've already discussed open access, common property, government ownership. I'm not going to discuss that again, but it obviously makes a lot of sense, not only in terms of renewable resources, but also non-renewable resources. I might have briefly alluded to that when I discussed property rights the first time around. I don't remember, but there's a big difference in this respect between the United States and most other countries in the world. So if you buy a piece of land in the US, you own not only the surface of the land, but basically everything that's under your feet up to the middle of the earth and all the way up to the sky. In most other countries, and Canada is not too different, you own the surface of the land that you buy, and that's it. And so in Western Canada, what really matters are surface rights, because even if you don't own what's underneath the ground, it belongs to the government or historically to the crown. Accessing the resource requires companies to deal with people who own the surface. And this is a notion that most Americans find really weird. I've been to a number of conferences where Americans come in and they're like, what is all that business about surface rights? I mean, why? And that's because, again, in the United States, you own everything on the surface, in the air, and under your feet, but that's the only country in the world that has that regime. And so what happens, I mean, Canada is a reasonably, well, okay, looking for my words here, let's say fair with clean institutions, and so if you find petroleum under your property, in most cases, well, you will benefit from it as an owner. In many other countries, when the resource belongs to the government, you know, people move in, they don't compensate you, they might make a mess out of your land, and so you don't have the same incentive to develop resources under your property. So this property regime does matter, but I'm not going to get to any more detail than that. Okay, in terms of environmental impact, there are obviously various ways resource exploitation can impact the environment. You can mine for a resource by going underground, so you don't touch the surface as much, but you might cause other forms of pollution, especially regarding water sources. You can dig a big hole in the ground, or you can flatten a mountain. I mean, you can collect whatever is good in a mountain and then put that dirt back on, so obviously you have an impact that way. You have greenhouse gases, you can build roads, there are again many ways you can pollute rivers in that process. There's obviously an impact in terms of the way you develop your resources, but I think there's no simple correlation between the size of a project and its environmental impact. Again, it all depends on how it's being done. So if you use modern technology, if you make sure that you don't throw stuff in a river, I believe that you can have less impact from a much larger project than the impact that you might have in a small project that is not run with all the safeguards that you find in more advanced economies. So, you know, we're humans, we breed, we consume resources, will always have an impact, but you should not necessarily assume that more wealth or the size of a project per se means that it will have more of an environmental impact than a smaller one that is not run as well, or it doesn't use state-of-the-art technology. Okay, energy transitions. I'll skip this. Yeah, I might quiz you about resource exploitation, but again, these will be from the small definitions on the side of your textbook, so this is not really the issue that I want to discuss. Industrial organizations of resource exploitation, here the authors are really bad. Yes, there are multinational corporations, there are small business, but there are a bunch of other firms in between that do kind of very sophisticated consulting work in terms of collecting and interpreting data, or having very specific types of equipment that they lease or that they will manage for larger companies. There's a whole segment of the market here that is missing in your textbook, and so it's one of the reasons why I don't want to follow it too closely. State-owned companies, in many countries historically, well, so again, in the United States, the resources were private, and as a result, a number of large private corporations emerged to develop resources. In other countries, sometimes you would have private investors that would come in first, but then their companies might be nationalized or they might be kicked out. So you might have heard of the Nobel Prize, I hope you did. Alfred Nobel, inventor of TNT, dynamite, that type of stuff. What is less well known is that he had two brothers who were even more successful than him, and they were the pioneers of petroleum development in Russia. So they invested a lot of resources there to develop those resources. The Nobel family, if you read their history, was truly remarkable. But then the Bolshevik, the communists come in and they just seize the stuff. And the Nobel were smart because they sold their company's stock when nobody knew if the Bolsheviks would win or not. They sold them at a big discount to the Rockefellers in the United States. And at least they recovered some money that way. But what happened there was that they were kicked out and their business was seized by the government. This was true in other countries, or in other places government created resource companies from scratch. The problem when you do those things is that these companies often have a dual mandate. On the one hand, they must develop resources. On the other, they must make sure to create jobs in places where there aren't that many jobs. And it's kind of hard to run a profitable business in that context. And then you often have people in government who want that business to hire their friends and stuff, so they're not always the best run. So again, there are pros and cons on both sides, but this is something that I discuss in more detail in my other class, so I'll just skip over it again. Okay, large companies today, there's another common misconception, and it is that the American companies, Texaco, Chevron, Exxon, whatever, have the biggest oil reserves in the world. Actually, they don't. The companies that really have the biggest oil reserves are really the nationalized companies in places like Iran, Saudi Arabia, and Venezuela. You don't hear from them all that much because their activities are by definition mostly concentrated in their own country. What American corporations will do, and you need to go down the list before you find one. So Chevron is down here, ExxonMobil. So they're good at extracting the stuff out of the ground, refining it, turning it into hundreds of products and selling it to people, but they typically don't own the resources that they exploit. So they need to strike a deal with the people who own the stuff, and that's how they produce it. The companies that own the biggest oil reserves are the nationalized companies in those countries here. So again, Saudi Arabia, Venezuela, Iran, Russia. Okay, commodity markets, you can expect a question on what a benchmark price is, a spot price, futures market, but again, these will be the little things besides the main text in your textbook. So long story short, you've got thousands of different deposits the world over for oil, for petroleum, for example, and the type of petroleum that you find in each of these deposits is not the same. Oil comes in different color, viscosity. This is a function of whether or not it has sulfur in it, if it has other bad stuff in it. So typically, the lighter and the sweeter it is, and sweeter, that's because historically people would literally taste oil from different deposits. The lighter and the sweeter it is, the easiest it is to turn into other products. So these deposits do command a premium over other types of oil. The location of your deposit also matters. But in order to make sense of these markets, what has evolved historically are a couple of benchmark prices. And in the case of the United States, this is the amount of oil that you pay for a certain quality of oil in a particular location, and everything else, all the other prices sort of follow those benchmark prices in lockstep. So there's one in the United States, there's one in Europe, there's one in the Middle East, but these things really benchmark prices are those that essentially set the price for the others, and that's how we can sort of make sense of markets. Spot prices are paid when commodities are bought and sold at a particular time. So if you go to Rotterdam in the Netherlands or outside of New York City, you've got huge refineries there, some of the biggest in the world. The oil comes from all over the world to be refined there. But if you want to buy something and get it rather at that moment, it's called a spot price. But most oil prices are actually bought in advance. So they're futures. So their price contract makes it for future delivery and can be bought and sold prior to delivery date. So you might buy from a producer that has yet to extract the stuff out of the ground a certain amount of oil barrels of a certain quantity for delivery in 6 months. So this is called a future because you don't get your stuff right now, you'll get it 6 months down the road. But once you've negotiated that contract with a particular firm or producer, you can then turn around and sell that contract to other people. So, again, for those of you who are in commerce and management, you know that already. The others, I'll just ask you to remember this difference between a spot price, something that you get on the spot literally, and future prices, so future contracts for delivery at a period of time in the future. Okay, so resource-based developments. The staple trap. Make a note for that. This is in the book. Basically, it's like everything else in life. When you've got a very valuable resource, if you're in a place like Alberta, it's very hard when oil prices are high to be active in other lines of work. And so when the going is good in the oil industry, they can pay people very well. And so if you want to start a business, I don't know, making furniture in Alberta, you have the roads, you have the energy, you can import the machines, but your problem is paying people enough to make sure that they want to make, let's say, furniture as opposed to working in an oil field. And again, when oil prices are high, nobody really can compete with what the petroleum industry is able to pay its employees. And so it might be that in a number of places, there's one big employer, one big resource that essentially prevents other alternatives from being developed in an economy. And in the long run, you do suffer. If you look at an economy as a region as opposed as to one particular business, you can suffer from this. Okay, the life cycle of Canadian resource town. Well, let's say it's 1900. Newsprint, so newspapers are still printed on paper. People have found ways to produce a newspaper more efficiently from the type of trees that you find in certain Canadian areas. People move in, they build a mill. In order to attract people in more remote locations, they pay them well. Then once the industry is launched, there's more demand for it. The infrastructure is built. It's kind of tough work, it's smelly work. You live in more remote areas, so you always pay well. So the going might be good at some point, and then people stop buying newsprint. People stop buying newspaper on paper. And then, if you're in one of those towns, this is what the situation looks like, and good luck selling your house and not taking a huge blow as someone who lives in that place. But the same is true if you live in a mining town and suddenly there's nothing else to mine, or if you live in a town that produces petroleum and suddenly the price goes from $150 a barrel to $50 a barrel. So life in a resource town can be good when the resource is sought after, but resources are cyclical. And if you can be sure of one thing, is that the price of any resources, for a number of consideration, either people don't want that resource anymore, like newsprint, or else there's a new technology that comes along, a lot more petroleum is produced, so the price of that commodity goes down. You can be sure that over time, this is true for all commodities. Commodities are cyclical. And life in a one resource town can be good, can be very good, or it can be very bad. It's rarely very stable in the long run. Okay, so the authors then discuss those issues from the perspective of people who live in large diversified cities like Toronto and people who live, let's say, in a town like Hearst or Sudbury or Thunder Bay, or a town that would have a big pulp and paper mill. So in cities, we want everything affordable and cheap. And people in resource regions obviously want their commodities to be as expensive as possible. So people in small town want the price of petroleum, want the price of newsprint, want the price of whatever it is that they produce to be high, but people in the city want to pay as little as possible, and so the logic there is antagonistic. Okay, but now the fun stuff. Okay, so you can expect a few basic questions based on the textbook, but there's one issue that the authors raise with which I profoundly disagree, and it is the notion that you will see here. I'll present you two conflicting school of thoughts, and they're squarely in one camp, and I'm obviously in the other. And so they believe that non-renewable resources, well, you know what, I'll present you two videos here. I'll say that the authors are closer to the first video when I'm closer to the second. So you're all familiar with David Suzuki, I take it. How many of you have seen the test tube before? Were you shown that in high school? Okay, so that's how this thing works.
You know, there are a lot of things that we can fix in this world. We can do something about it. We can design the cities that we live in, the kinds of houses we live in, the market, the economy, currency, how many trees we're going to cut, how many fish we're going to catch. Those things human beings can manage and control because we create them and do them. But some things are facts of life we have to live with. The speed of light, gravity, entropy, the first and second laws of thermodynamics. Those are things that we have to accept and work ourselves around. And there is another one that is absolutely crucial. It's a mathematical reality called exponential growth. If something is growing at 1% a year, it'll double in 70 years. 2% a year, it'll double in 35 years. 3% a year in 24 years. 4%, 17 and a half years. Anything growing exponentially will double in a predictable length of time. Now, I'm going to show you why all of this stuff about we got to keep growing, keep the economy growing, we've got to keep everything growing, is ultimately suicidal. I'm going to give you a system analogous to the planet, and that's a test tube full of food for bacteria. So the test tube and food is the planet, and the bacteria are us. Now I'm going to introduce one bacterial cell in, and it's going to divide every minute. That's exponential growth. So at time 0 at the beginning, there's one cell. 1 minute, there are 2. 2 minutes, there are 4. 3 minutes, there are 8. 4 minutes, 16. That's exponential growth. And at 60 minutes, the test tube is completely packed with bacteria, and there's no food left. So we have a 60-minute growth cycle. When is the test tube only half full? Well, of course, the answer is at 59 minutes. Even though it's been chugging along for 59 minutes, it's only half full, but 1 minute later, it'll be completely filled. So that means at 58 minutes, it's 25% full. 57 minutes, it's 12.5% full. At 55 minutes of a 60-minute cycle, it's 3% full. At 55 minutes, one of the bacteria says, hey guys, I've been thinking, we got a problem. We got a population problem. The other bacteria would say, Jack, what the hell have you been smoking, man? 97% of the test tube's empty, and we've been around for 55 minutes. And they'd be 5 minutes away from filling it. So, say bacteria are no smarter than humans. At 59 minutes, they go, oh my God, Jack was right. We got 1 minute left. What are we going to do? Well, don't give any money to those economists that are saying we got to keep growing all the time. Give it to those scientists. So they massively inject money into the scientific community. And guess what? In less than a minute, those bacterial scientists invent 3 new test tubes full of food. That'd be like us finding 3 more planets that we could use. What happens? At 60 minutes, the first test tube's full. 61 minutes, the second's full. 62 minutes, all 4 are full. By quadrupling the amount of food and space, we buy 2 extra minutes. Our home is the biosphere. It's fixed and finite. It can't grow. And we've got to learn to live within that finite world. Every scientist I've talked to agrees with me. We've already passed the 59th minute.
Okay, so pretty scary, but at the same time, it would seem pretty logical. So you follow this thinking here. So you double every minute. You've got one test tube. Even if you somehow create 3 more test tubes, you only buy a few more minutes. But if you buy that logic, isn't there a problem? So even if the bacteria say, okay, let's all go on a diet, you might buy a few more minutes, but then ultimately you're doomed, right? If resources are really finite, how is sustainable development possible? If there's only so much, and even if we keep the population at the same level, I mean, people eat, consume, burn. How is sustainable development possible if you buy into that vision? And you could say in theory, well, that's why we need to limit ourselves to renewable resources. This is why we cannot consume non-renewable resources. But you know, there's 7 billion of us, and there's nobody that shares that school of thought that says that we can sustain 7 billion people on renewable resources alone. There's just not enough food for our machines. The wind and the sun and geothermal simply don't produce enough food for our machines to sustain 7, let alone 8 or 9 billion people, as future demographic projections tell us will be on this planet. So if you talk to these people, they'll tell you, well, the earth can supply, on renewable resources, you can sustain at most 1 billion people. It might sound like a lot, but it's still 1 out of 7 at the moment. So who's willing to go? So, no wonder that if you buy into that vision, you'll be sort of pessimistic. Okay, but there's another view which says there's something wrong here. And the basic answer, which I will get back to later, is that people are not bacteria. Why? Well, we'll see that. So there are no real limits to growth according to that perspective, because humans are able to create other things. They don't just eat food and the same food over and over again. People create resources, they turn stuff around them into resources, and so they can expand their resource base by doing different things. So that's a video here that sort of introduces you to that perspective.
Another contemporary economic myth is that we're running out of resources. This fear that we'll use up the Earth's natural resources has been with us pretty much since the Industrial Revolution. Since the beginning of industrialization, people have feared that as firms used up the Earth's resources that we would eventually run out of them. And this fear continues today. However, this is largely a myth. In fact, we're not running out of resources. What we're doing over time is learning to use resources more efficiently and finding substitutes for resources as they do begin to deplete. For example, consider the story of copper. In the early 1960s, telephone use in the United States was expanding enormously. At the time, the only way to carry the data over telephones was over copper wire. And so as telephone use began to expand to new parts of the United States, the demand for copper began to rise. As the demand for copper began to rise, so did the price. The result of this is people began to worry we wouldn't have enough copper to wire the entire country for telephone use. But as we know, we managed to get around this problem. How'd we get around it? Well, 2 things happened. First, as the price of copper went up, copper producers found new sources of copper that were previously too expensive to explore. More important, we saw the development of substitutes like fiber optic cable, which is made out of sand. Now we carry our voice and data through fiber optic cable rather than copper, conserving on the use of copper and providing us with more of the services that copper was delivering. Another example is oil. Ever since crude oil was first refined in the 19th century, people have been concerned that we would eventually run out of oil. This became even more of a concern in the 20th century with the development of the automobile and the increasing demand for oil that came from that. But despite the concern that we might be running out, the reality is that proven reserves keep growing year after year, even as people are concerned that we're running out. If we look more closely at the data, what we find is that in 1882, estimates were that only 95 million barrels of oil remained. Given that we were consuming oil at 25 million barrels per year, that wasn't going to last very long. But by 1919, oil was still with us, and Scientific American reported only 20 years of oil left. Fast forward to 1950, over 30 years later, oil's still with us, and then the American Petroleum Institute estimated 100 billion barrels of oil left. Notice, that's 10 times the oil that was left in 1882. By 1956, people were predicting peak oil in the United States by 1970, but by 1980, remaining proven oil reserves were at 648 billion barrels. By 1993, 13 years later, that had grown to 999 billion barrels. By the year 2000, it was over $1 trillion. And most recently, in 2008, best estimates are 1.2 trillion barrels of oil remaining. When we put all this together, what we discover is that we're not really running out of oil. In fact, as oil prices rise, what oil producers do is to begin to look for new sources of oil. The reason why those proven reserves keep rising is because as the price goes up, it becomes profitable to search for oil in places that was previously too expensive. So as a result, we end up finding oil that we didn't know existed before the price began to rise. You can think about prices the following way. Prices are an incentive wrapped in knowledge. And so when the price of oil or copper rises, it does two things. It provides the knowledge to producers that signals to them it's time to find substitutes or it's time to find more efficient ways of using the good. But not just the knowledge, it also provides them with an incentive to do so. At the higher price, again, new sources of resources become more profitable. As consumers balk at buying the good, substitutes become more profitable as well. So if we're really concerned about running out of resources, the answer is not to restrict our use of those resources, but to give the price system and competition in the market economy the maximum play possible to create competitive prices that provide producers with the knowledge and the incentive they need to economize and to find substitutes as resources begin to get more scarce.
Okay, so he's one of those economists that David Suzuki doesn't like. But what does he tell you? Well, how do humans differ from bacteria? Well, humans are creative, humans trade, and humans have a society that is ultimately based in market economies, at least on the price system. And prices do transmit information, and they do promote adjustments between the actions of people. Nobody really needs to be in charge. All you need is a price that conveys both information and incentives. Okay, so what's especially disappointing in the chapter is that the authors come from the tradition of that guy, Eric Zimmerman. It's actually the first quote that they use at the beginning of the chapter, and Zimmerman understood that. And somehow they sort of lose track of that within their own chapter. So he has this quote that I like a lot. So again, this was almost a century ago, so previous to the emergence of man or really humans. The earth was replete with fertile soil, trees and edible fruits, rivers and waterfalls, coal beds, oil pool, mineral deposits, but there were no resources. Resources only began to exist when people came along, and resources ultimately depend on market conditions and technologies to create valuable things out of physical stuff. Now, the point that was made by another economist named Julian Simon is that you might think of non-renewable resources as being non-renewable because it's a finite amount of stuff in the ground. But ultimately, what's always renewable is human intellect. And our capacity to create more knowledge will actually end up creating more resources, even out of stuff that is not renewable in the sense that someone like David Suzuki understands it. And ultimately, what someone like Suzuki also doesn't get is that people don't care about resources per se, they care about the service. You want to move voice, you want to move data. How you do it is ultimately irrelevant. What you care about as a consumer is that the stuff actually gets done. And so again, you guys were born with those devices, well, if not born with them at least, they've been around for certainly most of the time that you were able to use them. And if you've never seen the wonders of a 1970s Radio Shack catalog, you could see how much money you would have had to spend on various devices to get the service that you get from something like this. Now, what you don't see when you use this is the amount of energy that is consumed to store, manage, transport the data. So there's a huge production of energy besides this. But all the other materials that were required in the past to get the same kinds of services are no longer required. So we need a lot more electricity, or we need just as much electricity as in the past, but the amount of the other stuff that we don't need is kind of staggering. Okay, so what I will try to do now is to summarize as fairly as I can the more elaborate version of the Suzuki and the other guy name is Horvitz vision of these things. So this is where you need to start taking notes. Okay, so what was conveyed in the David Suzuki video is what I would call the depletionist view of resources, okay? There's a tube, it's consumed, it's gone. Now, what are the key arguments? This is a vision that has been around for thousands of years, and so has the others. So what are the key arguments that people make who believe in one vision, and what are the key arguments that are made by people who believe in another vision? And what I'm presenting you here is my own synthesis, so it's gonna be according to your professor, what, blah, blah, blah. So this is what I wanna see. It's not in the textbook, it's not in one of the Mandarin readings. Okay, so again, this is the depletionist perspective, or depletionism. So the first argument that is always made by those people is that because resources are finite, everything else being equal, a reduced population will always enjoy a higher standard of living. So you've got one pie, you've got 10 people. How big are the slices gonna be? You've got the same pie, you've got 4 people. You divide it between the 4 people, obviously the slices will be bigger. So Thomas Malthus, who was probably the historical figure the most associated with that vision, even though he didn't say anything that hadn't been said before him, put it this way. Okay, if you've got a war and a foreign army invades your country and kills half of the population and destroy, the bridges, the mills, the schools, whatever, then half of the population that survives is not really better off. But if you've got something like the Black Death, or some other type of epidemic, and it only affects people, and it kills half of the people, but it doesn't kill the livestock, it doesn't destroy the infrastructure. Well, too bad for the people who are dead, but the people who have survived will be better off. Because again, there are more resources, fewer people, their slice is bigger. Okay, so everything else being equal, a reduced population will enjoy a higher standard of living. Seems logical enough, right? Okay. The second argument is decreasing returns, and for this I will ask you to sort of understand the idea and convey it in a couple of words. So basically what happens is that not all coal or petroleum deposits are created equal. Some have better quality oil, some are located closer to markets, some have both better quality oil and are both located closer to markets. So what will happen? Well, obviously, producers, being rational economic actors, will first extract stuff from the best deposits. And it will cost them that much to do that, and then they'll be able to sell their resource based on market demand at a certain price. But then once the best deposits have been depleted, you need to move on to places where the oil is much deeper underground, or the coal is further underground, or the quality of the oil or the quality of the coal is not as good. And so basically what happens is that over time, the cost of extracting a resource and delivering it to market will go up, because people exploit the best deposits first, and then as they need to produce more stuff, you need to extract resources from lesser quality deposits. So the price of a resource will go up. So there's a quote here, as long as you don't need to tell me that it's Jevons' quote, but I want you to have this idea. So he wrote a century and a half ago that the average price of coal, he thought, will become much higher than they were at the time, because the most cheaply and easily accessible fields and seams will be developed first. And then people will have to move on to lesser quality deposits. So to get the same amount of energy, as time goes by, you will need to pay more because the best deposits will be depleted first. Okay, so decreasing return, and you sort of convey that idea in a few words. Okay, the third is that an increase in either or both population or consumption must by definition result in greater environmental degradation. So the more people you have, the wealthier these people are, the more environmental impact they will have. Okay? There's more of us, we consume more, therefore the environmental impact should be more significant. So there's a quote here from over a century ago, so nature is destroyed in the United States. The more people, the more air and water pollution, the less trees you have, the less fishes you have in the streams, the more birds are becoming extinct. So this fellow here, Osborne, is really worried that the more people you have and the wealthier they become, the more humanity will pay a price in terms of impacting the environment. Okay, so, but here you just need to convey the main idea. Okay, another common theme among people who believe that, resources are finite, there shouldn't be more of us, is that we should not believe in a silver bullet that would take the form of a new technology that would make things a lot better. So you can point out to these people, well, yeah, but in the past a new technology came along and you didn't need copper anymore, you could have fiber optics. But what they will tell you is that technological change is always uncertain and unpredictable, whereas a decreasing population numbers and decreasing production and consumption level is a surefire way, is an absolute certainty in terms of reducing environmental impact. So technological change is uncertain. Decreasing the number of people and decreasing their standard of living is an absolute guaranteed way to reduce human impact on the environment. So again, this is a quote from 1948. The ingenuity of man will not be able to solve the final riddle, that of getting a subsistence from the earth. The grand and ultimate illusion is that man could provide a substitute for the elemental workings of nature. So this fellow here, you might see that kind of has the same name as that other one there. That's because that's his son. Okay? Another argument that is always made by that school of thought is that past successes are irrelevant to present conditions. So yeah, technology might have solved the problem in the past, but we live under completely different circumstances, and what was true in the past is irrelevant today. So that's a quote here from, again, nearly a century ago here. The present age is totally unlike any previous age. There is no longer isolation. Space has been annihilated because of the steam ship and the railroad. And electricity, the world as a whole is more of a single entity than before. So whatever happened before 1900 was deemed by 1922, or that time period, irrelevant in light of the different character of the economy and the technologies of the time. But of course, this could be 2017 also. We still have a number of people saying that, and that's always a theme. Forget the history, it's irrelevant. Now we live in a different world. So just past successes are irrelevant to present conditions. So in summary, and I'll ask you to remember that again, according to your professor, blah, 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 this is the kind of summary that I want to see. The biological carrying capacity of our planet sets absolute limits. There are only so many humans who can subsist on the earth in light of absolute limit. The less people will mean more wealth per people and a better environment and less pollution. We need to conserve for future generations. And ultimately, our economy should be built around renewable energy sources, because if we build a society by feeding our machines non-renewable resources. It might be nice for a while, but then like any resource time, when you run out of them, the whole thing comes crashing down. Okay, so you might quibble with that, but that's kind of my summary. So I think I'm being, within the confine of 10 PowerPoint slides, I think I'm being fair to the people who belong to that school of thought. Okay? Now what about the other side, the second video, the sort of Horvitz, Zimmerman, Simon side? Okay, the first thing, and this is a point that I've made before a number of times, trade and the division of labor will deliver greater material abundance per capita. So again, this is the argument that I've made earlier this semester. 100 people who specialize in what they do best and trade with each other will produce a lot more than 100 times what one individual can produce on his or her own. So by specializing in what you do best and trading with other people who specialize in what you do best, you produce a lot more than 100 people who try to do everything on their own, don't specialize in what they do best, and so produce a few things that are of low quality. So an early critique of Malthus is the French economist Jean-Baptiste Say. He writes, "It is abundance of productions, not the scarcity of consumers, which procures a plentiful supply of whatever our necessities require. And the most populous countries are in general the best supplied." So basically what he argues here is that if you've got an epidemic that kills half of your population, you should not think of those people as simply mouths to feed and suddenly there's more food. You've got to think of them as producers who specialize in what they do best and trade with each other. And what that epidemic does is destroy half of your production capacity. So maybe you had people there who were very good at developing, I don't know, pesticides that would deal with insects that attacks your apple orchards, for example. Well, you lose that person and suddenly your apple production goes down because your pest problems become unmanageable. Or perhaps you lose the person who was really good at building boats to move those apples around. And so it's not just that you lose half of the mouths to feed, but that you lose half of your production capacity. And there's nobody else in the economy who can do these things as well as the people who die. And so again, because 100 people who specialize in what they do best will produce a lot more, you eliminate half of that population, you destroy that production capacity. It's not just that you have less mouths to feed. And you cannot assume that the amount of stuff that exists around you will remain the same because people needed to create it in the first place. Okay, the second argument is that humans are creative. They're not just bacteria that consume beer or whatever. So this is Friedrich Engels, and yes, that's the Engels of Marx and Engels, the Communist Manifesto. And what's interesting about this debate is that you've got people on both sides of the political spectrum who take very different takes on this. So old-fashioned Marxists, for example, are completely on that side of the debate. Perhaps not on the importance of price, but on the idea that we're not going to run out of resources. Whereas other people from the left will be more of the David Suzuki line of thought. So Engels in 1843, I believe he's about your age, he's 23 back then, writes, "The productive power at mankind's disposal is immeasurable. The productivity of the soil can be increased ad infinitum by the application of capital, labor, and science." So we don't just produce resources, we create them. And if you look at our capacity to produce corn today, for example, in southern Ontario, we produce something like 7 times more corn on the same piece of land than was the case a century ago. So the idea that a piece of land can only produce so much has been proven wrong by the development of new technologies. You can actually increase the productivity of agricultural land. But you can also develop better medicines, you can develop better container ships, you can develop better ways of moving things around. And so humans can actually do more with less over time by using their brains and developing better technologies. We can transmit a lot more information today than when we relied on copper wiring, for example. And again, you're too young to remember the price of long-distance phone calls when we relied on copper wires, but trust me, it was a lot more expensive than calling people today. So at the same time, we have a much greater capacity to move information around, and the price of doing so has gone down. But the kicker here is that we used to use copper, now we use completely different technologies. And what Engels is telling you here is that this is how things happen. You can actually do more with less by inventing better ways of doing things. Another way to look at the problem here, William Petty, a few centuries ago, it's more likely that one ingenious, curious man may rather be found amongst 4 million than 400 people. So the more people, the more productivity, but also the higher the probability that the person who will develop the new technology will be born. Okay, another thing that allows us to be reasonably optimistic is that innovations are the result of new combinations. Those of you who are stuck with me for 2 courses this semester will have seen that before, but the way we create technologies is that we try to address problems by combining existing things in new ways. So, an example from the distant path, one stone here is used to treat leather, so to remove the fat, to remove the fur from a piece of leather from a dead animal. The other is used to drill a hole in it so that you can turn it into a piece of clothing. Well, you can combine the two and create an instrument, an implement that actually does both things. And so you don't need 2 stones anymore. One is enough, you scrape, and then you drill a hole in it. You combine a mine cart and a steam engine. Well, ultimately, after much trial and error in a few decades, you get a railroad. And so the key here is that the more invention you have, the more invention you'll get. The more we invent, the more things we have, the greater the possibility of new combination increases. Again, the more ideas we have, the more we can invent. It's not like there's a finite pie of invention in the world or a finite tube, but once you've invented this, there's less and less and less and less to invent. It's more like you combine things, and there's no limit to the amount of stuff that you can invent. Now, of course, most of these inventions will not be commercially valuable, but the potential is there. And the more inventions you have, the more you can invent. Okay, number 3 from that school of thought. Humans differ from other animals. And what they see is that there's no such thing as an ultimate limit in terms of what the earth can support. So a quote here from 1879, Henry George, an American economist. Both the jayhawk and the men eat chickens, but the more jayhawks, the fewer chickens, while the more men, the more chickens. So again, the whole point of agriculture is to replace stuff that is not really useful to human beings by stuff that is useful to human beings. And so the notion of a carrying capacity makes sense, for example, for a tiger or a lion. I mean, the number of predators is absolutely limited by the number of preys. But if you want to think of humans that way, well, again, the more jayhawks or the more lions, the fewer chickens. Well, the more men, the more chickens. You can increase, you can displace stuff that is not useful to human beings by stuff that is ultimately useful to human beings. So we're not like other animals that way. We can actually invent different things. Okay, number 4. Past successes are ground for optimism. So this is the price of wheat in the United Kingdom over the last millennia, roughly. So the population and the standard of living don't differ all that much during this sort of 700 or 800 years. Then the price goes up for a little while, and over the last century it's been going down tremendously. At first, people did not have the capacity to import large quantities of food from elsewhere. England is not the greatest place on earth to grow things like wheat. So what happens in the 19th century, the railroad, the steamship come along, and British people decide to specialize in what they do best, and they essentially gave up on wheat production. They began to import wheat from Canada, from the United States, from Argentina, from other places, from France, from Hungary, and suddenly more food is available and it's a lot cheaper because wheat production has moved to the best corners of the planet, something that could not be done before modern transportation technologies. And again, by that I mean the steel steamships and the railroad came along. And if you look at any resources in the past, well, there's ground for optimism because this is true for anything for which there is a market. Okay, this is sort of summarizing Horvitz arguments, and I want you to remember not only the title, but also what's underneath it. So in terms of free markets and feedback, as Horvitz was telling you, with the price system, when you've got resource scarcity, the prices do go up, and the prices always trigger the following. So again, if copper becomes more valuable, its price goes up, people will look for new deposit, or else they will bring into production deposits that they knew existed but were of lesser quality and not profitable at the previous price. People will use copper more efficiently, so they'll try to devise technology to get the same result using less copper, or else people will develop substitutes, like fiber optics or satellite communication, for example. And what happens over time is that once all these things have kicked in, the price of copper will tend to go down. So in the long run, in a market economy, yes, there are cyclical prices, but the trend, okay, I'll try to be on your side. So this is at the beginning of the time period. Yes, there are cycles, but in the long run, the price of all scarce resources for which there is a market tends to go down, even though people become more numerous and wealthier than in the past. Okay, a sixth argument, which is less understood. Pollution is a waste of money. And what I mean by that is that, again, I told you that resources don't exist in the abstract, they're created by people. And what you see happen historically is that people who buy a resource on the market, let's say crude oil, petroleum, when it was first developed, the only portion of petroleum that was useful was, if you buy a barrel of oil and you let it rest, the heavy stuff will go at the bottom, the medium stuff will be in the middle, the lighter stuff will spontaneously deposit at the top. So at first, when petroleum comes along, the only thing that is valuable is the middle portion, kerosene, because it's a substitute for whale oil. Everything else is thrown away. So around the first petroleum refineries, the environment is pretty polluted. But people have had to pay for the whole barrel. So what are you going to do if you're faced by the competition of if you're faced by competitors? Well, obviously, you see the stuff going through the chimney, you see the stuff going through to the river, and you're like, well, I've already paid for it. Why don't I try to develop something out of it? And historically, this is what happens in all industries. Because people have paid for the stuff, they have an incentive to actually turn pollution into something useful. So for example, the gasoline that you put in your car at first was a waste product. And that's because it was too explosive to be used as a substitute for whale oil. And so people just used to throw gasoline down the river. But then the internal combustion engine was developed, and what was a waste was then kept within the confine of the economy. Now, I'm not saying that this is perfect, that there are no greenhouse gas emissions, but the trend that you see over time is that business, for economic consideration, have an incentive to turn polluting emissions into something that they get money out of. So a quote here from 1876, so as the pressure of population increases, or what the author really means here, the more people there are, the more complex the division of labor is, the more new specialists emerge, the more these wastes are turned into something useful. So the more increases the efforts to utilize every particle of refuse which arises in large communities. So some historical examples, so coal gas. We take natural gas for granted today, but historically capturing it and moving it over long distances was to do. People didn't know how to do that at first. So what they would move instead would be coal. They would bring coal to the city. They would essentially cook it. And the gas that would escape out of from there would be sort of stored and then distributed to houses. So the coal is delivered, it's cooked, it's stored in those big tanks here. And this is then distributed to houses. But at first people had a problem. So this is how the process works. You basically bring coal, you pulverize it, you heat it, you get coal gas out of it, but you get some nasty byproducts. So coal tar, which is tar as the name implies, you would try to bury it, it would kill the vegetation, you threw it in the river, it would kill all the fish. You tried to burn it, it would cover your whole neighborhood in dark smoke. Some disgusting water here, and you would get some gas out of it. But because the coal that was burned often had things like sulfur in it, it was kind of problematic at first. So this is a chemist writing in 1852 about the early days of coal tar, coal gas. And basically, again, people bring coal to cities, they extract the gas, they pipe it to houses. What happens? Well, the gas arrives in the house, people burn it in the open, and then it has an intolerably stale odor. So if you know, sulfur smells like rotten egg, for example. So you burn that in your house, imagine the smell of rotting eggs. It was noxious when burned, it discolored the curtains, it tarnished the metals, it ate through the cover of books, and it covered everything with its fuming smoke. So imagine that you're a coal gas salesperson, and let me tell you about my great new product, coal gas. But what are the problems here? Well, things like sulfur in the gas and other stuff which are polluting, but eventually can be extracted and perhaps turned into something else. And this is exactly what happens over time. So all these sources of pollution, the coal gas, the disgusting water, the coal tar, all of these are turned into valuable products because you've already paid for that goddamn coal to begin with. So it makes sense if you're in business to try to create value out of pollution. Okay, slag is the stuff that is left over once you've extracted a metal from its ore. So, you bring a pile of dirt which contains some iron ore, you want to get the iron out of it, then you're left with piles of, sand, dirt, whatever. And this is what areas around steel mills look like in the United Kingdom all the way up to the 1870s. This used to be, a green field, what have you. There's a part of England that is known as the Black Country, and it became known as the Black Country because that stuff was piling up. But you go to the Black Country today and it's fairly green. Why is that? Well, because again, people turn a problem into a solution. So by 1881, out of that stuff come building blocks, building sand, cement, low-quality glass, mineral wool. Later on, it's discovered that there are things like phosphorus, for example, in some of these slags, so they can be used as fertilizers. But eventually, the thing that helps clean up the environment is the paving of road. Now, you take road pavement for granted, but in the grander scheme of things, it's only been around for a bit more than a century, and in many places, not even that long. So you turn a problem into a solution. And dirt roads were not very practical in most occasions, but it would also be very dusty. If you've ever been to a construction site, you see the dust flying around and stuff. Well, this is what most roads used to look like before road pavement came along. You get more mileage out of your cars, you can go a lot faster, you can move a lot more stuff, and you have a lot less particulate pollution as a result. If you look at some old houses in southern Ontario, you see, oh, the stones all look the same. Well, that's often because they're not stone. It's basically a compressed slag that is made to look like a stone. Okay, I've already told you the story of petroleum. So in the 19th century, sperm whales are the most sought after because they have a portion of, they have something in their head that gives you the best quality oil. And whale oil is sought after more than, let's say, vegetable oil or oil made out of pork fat because it gives you the best light, the less smoke, and the less smell. So people are willing to pay for that. All the other oils either smell bad, give you a lot of smoke, give you poor light. So there's a reason why people go out to distant places and kill whales. So luckily for them, a Canadian comes along, Gessner. At first he creates kerosene from bitumen. from bitumen, but then people realized kerosene can be manufactured from the middle of the oil barrel. And so this is the first oil well in the United States. That's a rebuilt one. That's your geography professor here. It's not that far. If you ever go to Pittsburgh, I encourage you to get off the road. They've built a nice museum if you're interested into those kinds of things. This is a cartoon from 1861. That's over a century and a half ago. And why are the whales so happy? Well, because kerosene is making whale oil increasingly irrelevant. So there are substitute products. Whale oil was the best oil. People were killing all the whales. The price of whale oil was going up. A signal was sent. Kerosene was developed, and suddenly whales are not so valuable anymore. And so, as I was telling you at first, only the middle fraction was useful. Kerosene is now mostly jet fuel. The reason why we use kerosene in airplanes is that it's less volatile than other stuff. So if a plane crashes, it's less likely to blow up if it is powered by kerosene, which it is, than if you were using gasoline, let's say, as we do though in smaller airplanes. And so these are roughly the two schools of thought, but there's something else I want you to remember. Running out of time, which school of thought seems the most in line with the available evidence? Well, I've already told you I belong more to one school than another, and I think that the evidence is pretty clear on that, and that's honestly why I belong to that school of thought, not because I'm paid to believe that. So there's a lot more people today than in the past, so there's roughly 7.45 billion people on Earth at the moment. 2 centuries ago, there was 1 billion people. So population today is at least 7 times larger than it was a century ago. We live a lot longer than our ancestors, and we're in much better health. At the same time, you look at air quality in a place like Toronto, for all of its problems, it's actually a lot cleaner than it was when people were burning wood or were burning coal. Okay, so Horowitz was telling you that there's more oil in the world today than there was in the past. So these are figures that that were published after he made his video. So this is the amount of oil that was economically recoverable in the ground in 1994. All of that was burned and some more. And in 2004, that's the amount of oil left in the ground. All of that was burned and some more. And in 2014, well, there's more economically recoverable oil left in the ground. So just to make sure that you understand, these are other figures. These were the world oil reserves, so the amount of oil in the ground that is economically recoverable in 1944. This is what is produced and burned between 1945 and 2003. And these are the reserves in 2003. So in other words, if you use as your basis 1944, 18 times that amount of oil was burned, and yet the amount of economically recoverable oil in the ground, petroleum, was 25 times greater. Okay, again, doesn't quite compute, but there's an explanation for that. The best way to convey what is going on here is based on the work of that fellow over there, McKelvey. This is how you should think of oil reserves. So first of all, nobody knows how much oil there is in the ground. And it's a big planet. So what happens over time is that, again, people extract and burn the most easily accessible deposits. But what happens is that new technologies open the frontier of what we can recover economically. So yes, there's a finite amount of oil in the ground. Nobody denies that. But there is, on the one hand, geological formations, and on the other, you've got the technologies to extract the stuff. And again, bacteria don't develop new technologies, people do. And so what happens over time is that you can push the frontiers of what can be recovered economically with new technologies. So yes, the amount is finite, but this is really how you should think of it. There's still plenty of oil left, and provided that we develop new technologies, we have oil and we can increase reserve for a long time to come, even though there's obviously a point where, you know, if we go on doing that for thousands of years, there will indeed be no oil left. But this is not as simple as saying that we're about to run out, because the amount that we can recover economically today is kind of limited. You need to think of technologies and expanding the resource frontier. Okay, that's a more sophisticated way of conveying the same ideas. I'm not going to go there, but again, we don't really know how much oil there is in the ground, but with new technologies, we keep expanding the frontier. Okay, to get back to Colonel Drake here, so what they could do in 1859 was to go roughly 20 meters underground. They were using primitive technology that came from salt mining, and it cost them, you know, an amount X to get a barrel of oil out of the ground. By 1980, for the same amount of money, you could go 1 mile offshore, let's say a kilometer below the sea level, and get petroleum out of that deposit for the same price as a barrel of oil would have cost you in 1859. And then in 2005, you could go 2 miles offshore. I could go a number of miles offshore, 4 miles underground here, and then go in all directions around that particular spot and extract oil for the same price as you could in the days of Colonel Drake. So again, the point here is that you've got geology, you've got the quote-unquote best deposits, but you cannot look at them in the absence of the technology that you have to extract oil. And it's not because you move on to less interesting deposits from a geological perspective that the price of extracting resources will go up. That's because you have new technologies now that allow you to get oil out of more difficult deposits for the same price as the quote-unquote easier deposits of earlier generations. Okay, so environmental benefits. What time is it? Okay, 5 more minutes, I'll let you go. This is a painting of Dutch whalers going to the north of Norway to harvest whale oil. Again, that's because it's very valuable. But if you're going to go all the way up to the Arctic Circle in those difficult conditions, you'll harvest anything that's valuable. So if you're a walrus or a polar bear, you better watch out because, you know, polar bear fur is very valuable. Now, obviously, the painter never went there because otherwise you would never think that polar bears can be clubbed to death by fishermen. But, you know, if you forget that, you know, the painter saw people coming from the north with both whale oil, walrus tusks and fat maybe, and polar bear fur. So it's not because a resource is renewable that its use is intrinsically sustainable. You can over-harvest a particular resource. And so the notion that we should not worry about renewable resources because they're renewable tends to forget that the rate of exploitation of those resources is obviously something that you need to factor in. The same is true for shifting agriculture in the past. So our ancestors were much poorer than we were. They were much less numerous, but they were also a lot less productive. And so the amount of land that they needed to use with bad technologies, or let's say poor technologies, was actually, the amount of land that they needed to feed one person was actually a lot larger than the amount of land you need today to feed one person. So these things do matter too. So that's why in many less advanced economies, you still have a lot of slash and burn agriculture. Well, in that case, they might be producing palm oil, and that's another debate. But in the poorest economies on Earth, where people live on land that is not so great for agriculture, they typically, you know, cut down the valuable trees, they burn the land, they get 1 or 2 crops, then they move on. They have a much larger impact per unit of food produced than people who concentrate productions in the best locations and keep increasing their yields, the amount of food that they produce on a piece of land over time. So here's another counterintuitive notion. So that's the extent of the forest cover in the United States over the last few centuries. So for those of you who are stuck with me twice a week, you know, this is the forest cover in 1620 in the United States, but we now understand that what happened there is that most of the Native Americans died of diseases, perhaps as many as 95% of them, and the forest cover came back because of that. So as Europeans and other people move inland, they deforest the land that was recently reforested. So by 1850, before the railroad is too important, people stick mostly along rivers, along the coastline. Then the railroad comes along, and the low point of the US forest cover is reached in the United States in 1920. And you can see, again, you should take those maps with a grain of salt. It's not like people had, you know, remote sensing or GIS at the time, but that's a rough estimate. You can see the amount of land, the amount of forest land that was left. And fast forward 7 decades, and you can see that the US forest cover is not what it was in 1620, but it has bounced back significantly from what it was a few decades before. The same is true for Western Europe. I'm not going to go there. I don't have time to show you. Well, I'll try. So Europe today is actually a lot greener than it was a century ago. So I'll let that play a few times. You can see the year here, 2000, 2010, so 1900. And you can see Europe is actually becoming greener throughout the 20th century. And again, what is happening is that people are moving out of the countryside into the cities. People produce a lot more food on the best land than was the case in the past, so you don't need to farm poor quality farmland. There are substitutes to biomass that are developed, often from petroleum products that were wasted before. And the result is that you've got a larger population, a lot wealthier population, but at the same time, more forests than before. So since I need to quiz you on something, don't pack everything just yet. Please remember this. According to your professor, oh, I should have taken care of the two here. Why are places like the United States and Western Europe more forested today than a century ago? Well, you burn fossil fuels, and yes, this can be problematic for climate change, but CO2 is plant food. So there is, according to all specialists, even people who are worried about climate change, something called a CO2 fertilization effect. So you take a lot of stuff from underground, coal, natural gas, petroleum, you burn that. CO2 can be problematic for climate, but it's also plant food. Then you've got a number of substitute products. So everything used to be made out of wood pretty much, but then plastics came along. Plastic were created out of pollution that originally came from petroleum refining. So a lot more things are made out of plastic today than are made out of wood. You look at the tables in front of you. In the past, a century ago, everything would have been made out of wood. And the productivity of agriculture, of forests, and the amount of useful stuff that we get out of a piece of lumber have all increased tremendously in the last century. So you combine all of that together, and you get richer and more numerous populations that actually have more trees around them than was the case a century ago. Okay, so you get more food out of the same piece of land, you get more wood out of forests because forests are better managed than they used to, and you get more wood products out of a piece of wood than was the case in the past. So, for example, sawdust used to be completely wasted in the past. Today we glue all of that and we come up with panels and other materials that we can use, whereas in the past sawdust would have been buried or burned. Another type of substitute products, well, you needed roughly about a quarter of the agricultural land in advanced economies to feed the workhorses and mules. The car comes along, you suddenly don't need to cultivate, you no longer need to produce food for workhorses and mules, among other things. Wealthier is often greener, so this is the island of Hispaniola. This is Haiti in the west, the poorest country in the Western Hemisphere, still mostly a biomass-based economy. You've got the Dominican Republic to the east. People there, partly because the government subsidizes this stuff, and partly because people are wealthier. People tend to burn things like propane and kerosene instead of wood. Can you see where the border is between those two countries? Again, people are a lot poorer, they consume a lot less. People are wealthier, they consume more. You cannot simply assume that because there are less people and they consume less, that they will have less of an environmental impact than wealthier people. Again, richer is greener, so a lot of people don't like the suburbs and places like Mississauga, but again, to get back to that US map, well, no cars, that's a lot less cars, 1920, about 100 million people in the US, slightly less than that. Today, a lot more cars, and I mean, a lot more cars. 300 million people who are a lot richer and a lot more trees. Okay, so I'm almost done. Why, in my humble opinion, David Suzuki, despite his expertise in other areas, why is he wrong about that particular issue? Because his basic analogy is wrong. Humans are not bacteria. In his story, bacteria do one thing. Well, I mean, he also bitch about economists, but they mostly eat, and that's all they do. until one morning they wake up and they create more food, but somehow they were not doing it before. But humans have two advantages, and there's a reason why we're at the top of the food chain. It's not because we're the strongest animals, it's not because we're the fastest, it's not because we have the biggest claws, it's not because we're the biggest swimmers. It's ultimately because we have the biggest brains. There's no other animal species out there that has the brain size that we have. This is a typical human adult. This is a typical human chimpanzee. Now, when you see chimpanzees on TV, you mostly see baby chimpanzees because they can get almost as big as humans, but then they get out of control. They're extremely aggressive. And so on TV, when you see people with cuddly chimpanzees, they're all baby chimpanzees because when they become adult, they're extremely ferocious and nasty, and you don't want to be close to them. But an adult chimpanzee is, you know, a fairly good size by human standards. But look at the size of his brain, and look at the size of ours. Humans have become good at combining existing things in new ways and at solving problems. We also do things that no other animal species does, and it's trading physical goods. Other animal species will trade grooming for protection. They will trade meat for sex. They will trade essentially services. Humans trade physical goods. We trade, we develop new technologies. No other animal species does it the same way. We're not bacterias. And so my final food for thoughts for you, and that's probably too much for one lecture, abundant resources and a clean environment are not, I would argue, a function of population numbers and how wealthy people are, but the technologies that they use and the institutions that favor the development of new technologies. And so far, the track record of humanity is not perfect, but the reason why you're alive today and so numerous and healthy and able to attend school in your 20s is because of what came before you, because of this trade, because of these technologies. And it might be good if we were to acknowledge that a little bit more. Okay, I'm done with you today, so if you came in late, you still haven't picked up your term tests. I have that here. I have some remark proposals, so please pick them up if you haven't done so already.